So Scott King, obviously I've introduced myself, a little bit about my background. I got my start sort of fresh out of school selling enterprise software. I've always played in the business process management space, made a move over to business intelligence. I've worked in startups as well as IBM, MicroStrategy and whatnot. My entree into kind of sales enablement came through MicroStrategy. So I was doing sales management at the time. We were rolling out a new Facebook analytics platform that eventually became sort of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. So they shut our division down over a weekend, and then, kind of working with Michael Saylor, one of the things that he was looking at was how do we, increase our productivity in sales. He asked me to set up sales enablement. So that was 2014 for me. I had never heard of sales enablement before. And I do come at it from a sales management or a salesperson's kind of point of view. So I think from a standard stack enablement system, I kind of look at it a little bit weird. So please feel free to ask any questions or heckle me if needed. But I do look at it like a salesperson. You'll see my slides look like a salesperson created his own slides. So no making fun of me about that. I'm a little bit sensitive to that one. But this was the first thing that I saw from Forrester. So 2014, I was in Phoenix, Arizona, and this is how they described what sales enablement was. So I liked it because the ongoing process that equips all client-facing employees to systematically have the valuable conversation, to me, kind of put the emphasis on the right, kind of the right motion. So if we peg everything against the customer journey and the customer experience and then kind of work backwards, that's how I look at it. So for me, enablement kind of encompasses a number of different practices, at least at Progress it does, where we basically are that fulcrum point between product marketing, corporate marketing, sales, and sales leadership. So we have to sort of speak all of those different languages because they are different languages. And how do we begin to account for all of the different motions, all the different pushes and pulls? And that really kind of falls on enablement from my standpoint. So after leaving MicroStrategy, I went ahead and I did some consulting in the Bay Area. So we were doing how do you build a sales kind of transformation for these companies that were going Series B to Series C, where they needed to move from a volume-based, low-touch sales model into an enterprise sales model to be more attractive to investors. And then I was recruited by Progress to come in and do work. Most of you guys probably haven't heard of Progress. We're publicly traded, not a large company. We're sitting at about 450 million. We grow by acquisition. So I've got sellers of 3 different generations, a number of different products. We're constantly auditing sales teams, trying to figure out what their go-to-market is, trying to get alignment. So a number of different products, a number of different motions. I've got inside sellers, BDRs. We've got big offices in Europe. We've got, our offices in the United States. We've got a low-touch sales model, and then we've got an enterprise sales model. So I enjoy it from an academic perspective because I get to touch a little bit of everything that's in technology. But kind of creating the process or understanding and being able to deconstruct how your sales team is performing and what levers you can pull to get immediate kind of action out of the sales teams became the biggest challenge for me. So what I thought I would do is kind of share with you what I think about sales performance or how I look at sales performance, the key, kind of key factors, how that aligns to the business. So for me, how does the sales motion align to the go-to-market that you have by product? What types of sales teams have you built? Are they aligned with the go-to-market? And then how does that plug into your product teams? So for now, at least short term at Progress, I actually own the product launch plan because we do channel. I'm responsible for channel enablement, but also the sales enablement. And to get that alignment, at least for the short term, we kind of own that as well. Then I thought I would take the example of content and training, maybe as one of the small examples of kind of what we look to tackle from an enablement perspective. And hopefully this is helpful. So this is how I look at sales performance, like a sort of a sales manager. So I am concerned about competencies. So with my sellers, with my sales teams, what are their abilities? What do they naturally have? How much experience do they have? And we do this through 360 reviews of all of our sales teams, and then we roll up through those sales teams. We then take a look at the skills. What skills do they have? Are they good in front of the client? Do we expect them to be in front of the client? How are their presentation or demo or whatever for their role? What are their skills? Then the next thing I care about is the activities, right? Activities drive pipeline, pipeline drives revenue, hopefully. So what activities are we actually tracking? And then what are the actuals? So I'll kind of dig into how we take a look at it. So I look at competencies not as an L&D person, so I'm sure I've named this incorrectly, but it's the way I think about it in my own head. But this is demonstrated behaviors. So what behaviors do I expect out of my sellers given the go-to-market? Then we take a look at the sales skills. So if it's an inside sales rep, what do I expect that salesperson to be able to do? If it's an enterprise sales rep, what do I expect that person to do? And then how are we measuring that? How are we letting them know? And how are we beginning to fill in the gaps for those people that have them? And then I kind of highlight the next thing under skills is, do I understand the product or solution in the context of a selling motion? So I've always kind of bucketed, at least in technology companies, as a seller. I always looked at companies and thought, well, they're a product sells itself company, right? That was MicroStrategy. Very proud of the technology, very inward out looking. Product sells itself. I don't really need salespeople, but they're there. Versus kind of that sales first kind of style company that tends to be a little bit more customer focused, right? Product in context is really, who should I be talking to? What types of conversations should I be having? As a seller, I found that I could sell a lot more and be a lot more effective the less I knew about the product and the more I knew about the problem that I was solving, right? So I say product in context, and it became important for me as we were looking for alignment through marketing, through product marketing. It was a pretty big distinction to kind of drive through. And this gives me I think I lost my do-whammy here. Can you advance the slide? Hey, Jordan. Can we advance the slides? I don't know if this guy, there we go. So that gives me my proficiency measurement. Just to kind of highlight, I know with L&D folks, competencies kind of include both the skills as well as the behaviors. For me, I kind of broke it out. Abilities and behaviors are something that I look at. It's super important. When you overlay that against your pipeline, it'll actually give you some pretty interesting increments that you can begin to attack as an enablement team. And then underneath the bar, skills and knowledge are the next components below. So as I mentioned, we do 360 reviews, sales management, sales teams, so that we are able to, at a quarterly basis, really assess what they're actually doing out in the field, what their peers see them doing, what they're, the people that are working with them in the deals, how effective are they, where they have strengths, where they have weaknesses. We test the sales skills, not only in pitchback sort of exercises, but we also do it in the context of the actual selling motion. So the expectation of our sales managers is that they are doing those measurements in front of the client, listening into calls. I mean, the standard kind of stuff that you would expect. And then product exams, just to get an idea of what do they know? Do they know when to use it? Who do I call? Is it going to be relevant, what I have to say, right? As we move over to the other side, I care about sales activities. So depending on the sales motion, I've got a weekly, monthly, quarterly cadence. For an enterprise rep, it's going to be face-to-face meetings. There's different components that I want to be able to track. For inside sellers, obviously, it's a little bit different. The idea is, do we have it defined, and are our sales managers actually using it as a component to drive their pipeline? They'll usually say yes. The answer is generally no. This is how you're able to audit whether or not you have an active sales process in place. So whenever we go to look to acquire a company, these are the metrics that I look at. This is how we begin to kind of break down whether or not they have a sales process, whether their go-to-market is plugged in, where we think we can get some efficiencies. Last one is actuals. So I care about growth pipeline. We do have sort of, like I said, a number of different motions. Not everybody's greenfield. We do have our named account management teams and stuff like that where we're looking for growth, maybe 10% out of a certain client. So I do growth. Forecast accuracy is important for progress. We're a value-based software company. So at the end of the day, really, when we go to the street, we want to be as accurate as we can be. We're looking for margins versus growth. And then what's their year-to-date performance? And that gives me my performance metrics, right? What that allows us to do is begin to align to the go-to-markets. So this is how I look at the organization. At the top, I have the buying cycle. This is really my go-to-market. So I work with my product marketing teams. We understand what the customer journey looks like, what their expectations are at any one of those stages. I then have my selling cycle. So depending on the type of sales motion that you have, you may have, maybe you leverage Medic, maybe you leverage your own. I like to call ours open source. We take a little bit of whatever seems to work depending on the motion, but we know what steps we expect to see given the motion. Below that, I have my skills requirements. So this is where enablement begins to step in. Based on the customer's expectations at any one of those stages, what skills, what competencies do we expect our sellers or our sales teams to show in order to execute effectively, right? Below that is our content strategy. So for me, I move to digital distribution of all of our content as quickly as I can because we want to begin to create that sales content that they can actually use in the sales cycle. And then the last one is my analytics layer. So why is this important? When you take a look at the types of leads that you have coming in, depending on your go-to-market, when you're working with your product marketing teams, in a low-touch sales model, let's say that's where you're expecting your leads to come in. Maybe it's a trial download, inbound leads, maybe it's even a demo request, right? So we know where that falls in the sales cycle. We know where the customer is in their buyer's journey. So what do I do with my sales teams? At this point, the only thing I care about is anything, well, for me, for the left of that line, right? So now from an enablement standpoint, I focus all my time and energy on taking the product marketing messaging, the marketing messaging that's a one-to-many kind of stance, and we have to convert that to a one-to-one messaging in order for a salesperson to actually be able to use it. So it's really important to understand what's the intended motion coming out of your marketing team to understand very specifically where I want to be able to train up my sales team. So if I'm looking at an inside sales team, then I'm expecting marketing to get me a certain part of the way through my sales motion, right? That's fine. That can be one-to-many. That can be on the website. That can be in the marketing material. But once I transition over to my sales teams, this is where I want to spend my time. So my sales training, my skills training is all to the other side of that line. I'm not as concerned, unless I want growth paths, I'm not as concerned with anything to the left of the line. That allows us to stay focused, keep the sales enablement team small, but it allows us to be very, very precise about what we're training and what we're asking our salespeople to do to be successful. Biggest failure that I see is, especially with the startups, for us when we acquire a new business, they're trying to juice their revenue, and then they say, well, our salespeople don't freaking cold call. Lazy pieces of shit. They need to get out there and they need to make some cold calls. Now you've asked them to do something very different. Now they're doing outreach. So now my one-to-one messaging is completely different, and the amount of skills that they have to actually have is also very different. So you've asked them to do something they're not really capable of doing unless you get super lucky. It's a huge transition, taking an inside sales rep and turning them into enterprise. Instead of having a product conversation, now they're having a business conversation. They can't even talk about product for another, 20%, 30% of the actual selling motion. So you can't as easily ask them to do. And the question is, how am I aligning that to my go-to-market? If my go-to-market is we should be doing outreach, then great, I need different sales reps. In the US, the difference between that and that is maybe 100,000 in base. So you can't just, the business needs to understand, marketers need to understand, the product marketing teams need to understand, depending on the motion that we've set up, these are the skills that we're working towards. I can try to grow other skills. This takes years. Or I can hire for those skills. And that's expensive, and they should know that. So anyhow, that's kind of how I break it down. We're able to align to the customer buying cycle. I need to know what the go-to-market is. We digest the go-to-market, and we push it out to the salespeople with the information so that they understand exactly who they should be talking to. Who are those key personas? What are those key players? What messages are going to resonate in a one-to-one kind of standpoint? And then we work towards building the skills and the competencies as it relates to what we expect them to do. We do build our own bench, so I am able to kind of bring people forward in their sales motion, but in the short term, being a value-based company, I expect them to perform kind of day one. Content strategy. So when I said that we did the competencies, we do a 360 review. So it's usually a sales engineer, it's a couple of sellers, it's a sales manager. We're able to kind of dig into what are the behaviors that I expect out of my sales teams, right? When you lay that across your buyer's journey and you lay it across your sales cycle, you can start to see where the gaps are with your sales teams. If you overlay your pipeline, you can also see which deals are at risk. So a lot of times the idea is when you go to your sales management team, maybe they've got an underperforming team. For me, this was one of my sales teams in the United States. I don't remember which one. But they come in and they say, well, shit, let's roll out Challenger. Or I need negotiation training. And then they want to bring everybody in because it's their mid-year. And they want the salespeople to sit there for 3 days. And at the end of the day, that's expensive. It's worthless, wastes their time, blows my credibility. What I want to be able to do is partner with my sales management team, partner with my sellers. I want to understand where they're strong and where they're weak in their selling motion. So if I take a look at, well, I don't know how to do this, but if you take a look at the prove phase, in this particular case, you'd see this entire team was struggling through that segment. So call it 40% to 60% of the sales cycle. Now my sales managers are just thinking forecast, forecast, forecast. So they're upside to commit in their pipeline. So they're looking at everything 80%. What they're not noticing is that they have gaps. So we know that there's a gap in the prove phase. It's usually where you're doing your demos or proof of concepts, not an untraditional place to have failures. We also know that state of the industry is we're in the qualification step. They feel weak there as well. So what I do is I spend my time working with them and figuring out how we begin to plug those holes. And the idea is I want my salespeople to be speaking to customers 50 hours a week if I could, because that's the selling time that they have. I don't want them reading content. I don't want them sitting in training. I don't want them thinking about it. We want to figure out exactly what we're trying to fix. And then through those increments, we can show success without necessarily using the pipeline or the closure rates as our measurement. So competencies give us a common language for our sales management. The 360 feedback makes everybody accountable from a sales team perspective. And then we are very specific about the opportunities for development. So what I found is I'll have enterprise sales reps that are extremely good at the tail end of a sales cycle and really remarkably bad at prospecting. I've got young guys that are really good at prospecting, but you'd never know because they lose it somewhere in the middle of the sales cycle, right? And they can't figure out why they're not doing it. And the thing is, when you're working with your marketing teams, you're working with your product teams, my salespeople are 50-50, which means 50% of their income is tied to whether or not they're successful. So when I hear things like, well, they should read this, or they should do that, or they should go through training, well, 50% of their income, man, they lose their job. Nobody's more incentive or in line to produce than your sales reps. So how do we work through making them more successful, lowering the increments so that we can see where they're dropping the ball, and then begin to fix those? So for me, this is kind of the stack rank where I look. So from an enablement standpoint, the number one thing I want to do is see if I can fix a process. If I can fix a process, so for us, I think I mentioned the proof of concept stage for this sales team. They weren't using a sequence of events document. They weren't managing those proof of concepts. They weren't getting the conversion rates that they should have. That's a process enhancement, which means I don't have to disrupt the seller. I don't have to disrupt their sales motion. I can institute the process and I can have an impact. The next one I want to work on is on-the-job training. Once again, I'm not disrupting their motion. I'm trying to align with them so that they can continue to make their phone calls. They can continue to get out in front of the client. But now I'm doing on-the-job training. Mentoring and coaching is the next lever that we'll pull. And for us in 2020, mentoring and coaching is our big focus. And then down the stack is when I start caring about knowledge management and training. Training's an expensive way to do it. It's expensive for me to produce and keep up to date. It's expensive to pull everybody together, 3 days of their time. If I'm doing that, it's because we want to work on something very specific so we drive the right behavior versus the broad training where they go, maybe you spend $25,000, $30,000 on a workshop and then they say, well, yeah, I got a great tidbit. Well, for $30,000, I hope you've got more than a tidbit, right? We want to be super specific about what we're bringing them in to do their training. Content example for me was actually Comp Intel. So the constant kind of retort from the field was, we need more comp intel. As a salesperson, managing salespeople, we could go pro at bitching. There's always a reason why we weren't able to do it, and it's almost always because I didn't have the right competitive landscape. Need to understand more about my competition. The challenge is, what is that, about $4,000, $5,000 per if you outsource it to figure out what the competitive battle card might look like if you're outsourcing it. And what we found when we actually started working with the sales teams was it wasn't that they didn't understand the competition, it was that they didn't understand how to have a competitive conversation. So it was a skill, not a content gap. And the more my marketing teams would push out content, the more they would bitch about this. We're spending money and we're not getting the result. And a lot of it just had to do with train the people on how to have a competitive conversation and how should they manage that relationship. This was from conversations that win the complex sale. For me, it was one of the most compelling. Confused look. You need me to walk you through it? No? You good? I think it's kind of awesome. Anyhow, so coming from a BI background, and when we were building out our sales performance model, I needed a model that I could ask questions and be able to get quick answers. So like I said, we go through the 360 reviews. We make sure that we can see them actually using the skills that we expect them to use. We test them on the product knowledge in the context of the selling motion. We're managing our activities, and we're tracking the actuals. What this allows me to do is begin to ask questions. So I could walk in, one of our products is Sitefinity. It's a CMS product. We manage it through inside sales. We manage it through our channel. We work with digital agencies. And somebody comes to me almost weekly and says, pipeline's down. Okay. Normal deal is pipeline's down. Field marketing says we're creating, lots of leads, and your salespeople can't sell their way out of a paper bag. And the salespeople say, well, marketing's shoving, wood into my backyard, and I'm spending all my time cleaning out these lead queues, right? Not a helpful conversation. Doesn't help us know how to fix it. And so what we do is we take a look at it from a sales side of the house, just keeping our house clean. Pipeline's down. Do I have the amount of activities that I would expect to see to have those activities or to have that pipeline? If the answer is no, more activities, right? If the answer is, yeah, we got plenty of sales activities, we don't have the pipeline, well, then my next question is, well, maybe we're just shitty at delivering it, right? So then I go, well, do we know how to demo? Do we know how to present it? Are we presenting the right message to the right people? And so now I'm playing out over here. If it turns out that the sales skills are bad, then we train on the sales skills. Then we measure on the sales skills, and then we use our sales managers to kind of press those sales skills to see if it has an effect. If it turns out that it's product knowledge and context that we're struggling with, then we're looking at product trading. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. But if it's one of those twos, then I'm going to work on my competencies. So that's how we begin to dissect that component. If I come down and my pipeline is down, my activities, are pretty good, and everybody seems to understand what they're doing, then chances are what I've got is a messaging problem. And then I can go to marketing. So if we're actively pretty good, within range, with our presentation skills, the guys seem to know the product, then we are dealing with a messaging problem, and then marketing can go to work on it, right? So it allows us to dissect that. Whenever we acquire a company, or we do our hiring, and at Progress, we're at about 22% turnover, which is healthy for us, for our sales team. So we're constantly onboarding, constantly bringing people in through through our funnel. We interview based on the competencies so that we have a competency measure when they come in. We evaluate their skills during the interview process. And then from an onboarding perspective, that allows me to focus on product and context. And then we're driving towards activity, which gives us a much shorter time to productivity for our new sales reps. All fairness, a lot of that is on the inside as well, which I think we would have short times of productivity either way. But onboarding, we just work counterclockwise. For diagnosing problems, I work clockwise. I know this sort of seems somewhat rudimentary, and obviously there's the analytics behind it, and we use Qualtrics and Litmus and a number of tools in order to get these measurements out of the organization. But conceptually, this is how we have those conversations. So if product comes to me and says, we've got a new release, and the question is, how does that plug into the go-to-market? Once I understand that, is it an inside motion? Is it an enterprise motion? Which sellers actually have the capability to sell it? And are we pushing it through the right funnel to get the appropriate interaction that we're looking for? The other thing that I think is important for us is forecasting. And what's interesting to me is we use our forecasting, we use our pipeline to come up with our budgets. And at the end of the day, nobody ever says, well, we should consider the source, right? So they look at the pipeline, they look at the forecast, and they think, well, this is how much business we should do. And I feel like this actually gives us a measurement on whether or not our sellers are actually qualified to give us that information. Even though it's in Salesforce, we do have some measurements in place. So for me, this was a helpful way to kind of break down a sales performance model that got me away from just using Salesforce in order to kind of diagnose problems that we have in our organization. Or challenges with different product lines, right? So at the end of the day, it allows me to be precise. We got 8 product lines that we go to market with. I've got 7 different types of channel partners, 4 or 5 different types of sales motions in my organization. And this is how we go about, or I go about managing that. And that's it. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Actually, if I may, can I make an observation?
Sure.
So I think many of us will have heard this sort of industry myth about 3 times pipeline.
Yes, yeah.
And it's very interesting because when I work with clients who are really accurately measuring the type of opportunity in their pipeline, they found a wide range of coverage required depending on the opportunity type.
Yes.
So, for example, a renewal, relatively low multiplier. Net new business, new product, new company, much higher multiplier. But I wondered whether you all looked at that.
Yeah, and we have to, right? Which is why I just kind of use that broad term. So for existing accounts where we're doing major account management, we're looking for 10% growth out of those particular accounts. With our renewals, we're looking at a 90% or 92%, inside of renewals. For certain product lines where we expect 35, 40% growth, then I expect massive pipeline. The biggest challenge that I had was we had, like I said, 3 generations of sellers in the organization. Many of them were coming from an account management standpoint. And then the other side was I had a bunch of youngsters really at the end of the day who were inside kind of sellers that were looking for just that quick hit. And what we needed to do was kind of begin to put measurements in place to where they could do stretch goals. I wanted my inside guys, which we have a big inside presence in Boston in the United States and Sophia covering for EMEA. The question was, how do I get them to start to think a little bit more broadly? Like instead of taking a deal down quickly, how do we, kind of expand that relationship? Which means they're going to need to show that they have pipeline out 9 months versus really just knowing, well, I'm going to hit my number, on leads that are coming in this quarter. So we use it just kind of broadly, but by business, we know what we expect, if that makes any sense at all. All right. Any other questions? All right, guys. Well, I think up next, who do we have?
I had a question.
Oh, yes.
I had a question. That's okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
I didn't have my glasses on, so I can't see shit.
That's fine. This might be too broad of a question.
Uh-huh.
You might not have time to answer, but in your sales performance model, it's pretty kind of clear to me how you'd be able to measure some of those things, like obviously using Salesforce or CRM.
Yep.
But I'm curious, how do you measure the majority of that? Like, you're talking about diagnosing skills.
Yep.
How are you doing that, one, and how are you scaling that across, the business?
Yeah, no, fair enough. So for the 360 reviews, we're just using Qualtrics. So I've got a competency model that we've developed, and we use Qualtrics. It's something that we do quarterly for some businesses, maybe 6 months, every 6 months for others. But I use Qualtrics. From a kind of LMS perspective, we use Litmus, an SAP product. That's fantastic. That allows us to get the product knowledge and context, right? Articulate to Litmus, it's pretty straightforward. I also use Articulate to do our playbooks because we want to deliver everything digitally. That's how we do it. It gives us a nice responsive web for the channel, which has been nice. So for me, it's Qualtrics to Litmus. Then I got Salesforce, and our reporting BI tool is Tableau. Is that helpful? Sure. Buying cycle and buying cycle and sales process the same for SaaS versus enterprise? No. It's different, right? Well, for us it is because of the different SaaS kind of products that we have. I think that you can do SaaS and enterprise. For our salespeople, for me, it's a little bit frustrating because it's the same amount of work for a third of the money. So it's kind of difficult from an enterprise perspective. But for us, a big part of our business is ISVs that have used our technology to build their platform. So for us, it's a different motion. And then the bottlenecks I face from enablement to sellers is usually communication. So one of the things that we implemented was a clear and sort of authoritarian communications practice in the organization. First 2 weeks is for training. Then we go 6 weeks of open communication from everybody in the organization out to sales. Last 4 weeks of a quarter is completely shut down. Nobody can talk to sales except through enablement. What that's allowed us to do is knock down a lot of the chaos between marketing to sales, sales back to marketing, sales to product. So communications almost always, like how do you get the feedback from the field and make it productive? Product management always wants it. But in the same breath, what that does, it opens them up to take a lot of questions and get a lot of demands from the sales teams without qualification. So for us, that's the biggest one. And then there was another question about failed Challenger. So when I came to Progress, they had just rolled out Challenger. Part of the problem was that we didn't have a Challenger motion at the time. We were, sort of total book of business was the main motion that we had in the field. We adopted Challenger. At the end of the day, Challenger is kind of the front end of solution selling. It's really a rapport building exercise. At least it was back then when we rolled it out. It was super expensive. It was really more of a helpful tool, I think, for product marketing than it was for sales. And they tried to do it top down. So at the end of the day, what we do is we'll do it from the bottom up. I mentioned the failures. So what we'll constantly do as it relates to any sales process changes, we'll pick a team within the sales org. We'll run it through. With their success, other teams will demand it. And that allows us to kind of go with a bottom-up approach for any process change versus the way we rolled out Challenger, which was top-down. They changed Salesforce, made demands, and kind of moved along. But it wasn't aligned with the commission strategy or really even the motion for the seller. So it was just a kind of a miss across the board. For us, it was. Not to say that the process does, it's just for Progress, it was bad. Any other questions? All right. So